Okay, so hello everyone. So I'm going to share my screen. Uh, Let me see. Okay. Okay. Is my screen visible? I can't see the chat, so I need confirmation if my screen is visible.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Let me just present this. So let me just let my out join first so that I can see the chat while I'm doing the lecture series. Okay, so hello everyone. I'm assuming I can start now. My name is Kelvin, and I'm one of your core adjudication panels. So today we'll be talking about how to evolve cases in AP. This is something that people often talk about and debate. It's one of the more intermediate factions or intermediate factors in a debate, especially when you're debating in Asian parliamentary where things can get stale really fast. So let's talk. First off, the strategy of evolution. So let's do this etymologically. By etymologically, this means that we'll discuss what evolution means and then we'll try to weigh it down in debate terms. So, what is evolution? So, there's gradual change, growth, and development. So, in evolutionary species, species do not survive due to stagnancy. So, species do not survive just because they're alive or just because they have traits, but because they have the mechanisms of adaptability and their ability to evolve. So, how does this end up relating towards debate, right? So, in a debate session, especially in a debate round, a debate without gradual development becomes static. So, what happens when a debate is static is multiple things. So, you can see from this diagram, there is a circle that encompasses both teams. So, there's a staticness of both cases, meaning there's no attempt on case engagement because of the stubbornness of cases, meaning that rather than trying to engage and expand your case, you're focusing more on trying to reinforce the existing case, just responding without adding anything new. And it means then that the case becomes very static and there's no essence of engagement. So there's no extension or exploration of further reasoning to add to the case. It means that even if there is an already sufficient extension or even if there's an already sufficient mechanism that comes from your first speakers, there's no added definition, there's no added discussion that ends up elevating the round or making the round much more engaging or much more exciting. There's multiple deadlocks that continue to be unresolved because extensions and the mechanism of evolution for debate is not necessarily just a way to make things better, but it's also a way to fix the things that already exist in debate. Of course, your first speakers only have 7 minutes of speaking, so of course they're not going to fulfill and fill in all of the gaps necessary immediately as a first speaker. So that is your role. You want to be able to pivot and make sure that your mechanisms end up not only adding to the case but fixing things that exist from the first two speakers. Next, it's also harder for the judge to take notes and assess the debate because of the lack of development. Because the ability to create evolution inside the debate is not just a mechanism of fixing things and also making things much better, but it's also a way for interaction to happen. Because engagement and the ability to engage with each other's cases is entirely dependent on the existence of evolution. What does this mean? Even if you have one case all throughout the debate, the development of that case, i.e., how the case furthers itself, and the ability for that case to be engaging towards another round, needs an evolution process. You need to develop and you need to add things in order to make sure that that discussion that was already flagged on your first speaker becomes much more important throughout the later rounds, right? Hence, it's easier for a judge to weigh discussions that you're able to evolve rather than discussions that you're not able to evolve because you keep reiterating the discussions from your first speaker. So, first speakers do not need to say everything. And this is something that I also get caught on. Sometimes decide to say everything and I decide not to say or allow my second speakers to say random things. So, if the first speaker launches everything, it leaves room for a lot of things. So one, it's unstrategic because there's possible refutations of the cases and because of the cases launched too early, right? So if I say something that's probably a good extension, but I say it too early and I'm not able to build it well because I have another discussion that I want to also build on, it means that number one, people can refute that immediately, which forces your next speakers to pivot on trying to defend you rather than creating a new extension, which is also unstrategic. But it means then that they're unable to extend. So it's not just that they're forced to pivot towards defending you, but it's their only way of becoming relevant because you said everything. So it forces your next speakers to parrot your statements, which stagnates the case, right? And it means also you're overloading yourself, which means that there's many topics at once in a single debate speech, which leaves room for many logical inconsistencies that can be targeted. Why am I talking about this? Because the mechanism of case evolution is not just how do I make my case better, but it's also a strategy that happens in AP and also BP discussions where you want to be able to make sure that the things that you put in your speech are important not just to you, but towards all the other speakers next to you, right? This is where we go on to the next discussion. A debate with evolution is developed, and this is where the comparison happens. A static case is very, very weak to a developed case because, one, there are more explicit reasonings, right? There are more things to back up that case, and there are more impacts. There are more things that you can add, like analysis, to back up the developed case, right? This means then if there's more things, it ultimately adds more importance specifically towards the team that decided to develop their case rather than the team that decided to keep reiterating their case. Because although the case stays correct, the fact that there's more things that happen inside the opposing team means that that opposing team creates much better levels of importance, much better levels of impact towards the debate, and they're able to create better contributions, right? Secondly, the developed cases extensions directly attempt to engage the static case, right? You see that on the tip, or there is a direction that happens towards the extension where they often go leaning towards the other case or the case of their government side, right? This is important because it means then that engagements and evolutions are often directly proportional to each other. The more you evolve, the more you're able to reach that engagement and the more you're able to hit each other, right? Which is very important because a debate is often supposed to be a clash between two different ideologies or two different ideas that is posited in the debate round, right? So this means then, when the developed cases expansions directly attempt to engage the static case, it breaks the deadlocks and clinches the winning conditions, right? This is why oftentimes you see a lot of debaters talk about deadlocks and the win conditions because not only are these things important, but these are also case evolutions. Because the way to evolve is not just to be able to make sure that you're better, but it also is to be able to make sure that you're surviving. Because people and organisms don't just randomly evolve random traits and decide that that's the best fit. Of course, there are metrics and mechanisms to be able to ascertain if that evolutionary procedure is correct, i.e., natural selection. And that's the same thing with debate. You have a winning mechanism that ensures that, hey, I'm able to win this debate regardless of what government is going to say because I was able to evolve my case. Lastly, then, the growth of the case opens up the debate to more responses. And this is very important because I'll talk about this later, but the responses necessarily need to be banked upon existing analysis from your debate, right? Because the moment you flag a new response that is not necessarily contingent on any analysis that comes from your preceding speakers, both opposition and government, it makes you look kind of, out of this debate, right? So the growth of the case opens up the debate to more responses. So when my first speaker decides, or my second speaker, and I'm with when my second speaker decides, hey, I want to talk about like, hello, is someone unmuted? Okay, three, two, one. Hey, I want to talk about things like, oh my God, there is accountability, right? And I want to be able to, also increase the discussion by saying things like sustainability. So now, as a whip, I can also respond via the analysis on sustainability because, there's already an existing flag for that analysis coming from my second and first speakers. This also opens up to more comparatives and essential case aspects that enrich the round, right? Tell me if I'm moving too fast and tell me if you guys have any questions mid discussion, right? So if you guys don't have that much discussions, then you can just flag it in the chat. So the case starts to evolve in your second speaker. This is very important because, of course, you're able to evolve the case in your first speaker. That is very important. but it doesn't necessarily mean that that evolution is a case evolution. Rather, it's just a build of your case because it's the first speaker. You're flagging everything first. The case starts to evolve in your second speaker. So rather than building everything at first, you want to separate arguments that need to be launched immediately, which is things that the first speaker can talk about, and arguments that can be supplementary in nature. So what does this mean then? Let's talk about this. This house regrets ecotourism debate. Probably the things that are most proximate is number one, you want to be able to talk about the sustainability of the ecological spot. Secondly, the benefits of ecological practices. Those are things that you need to launch immediately because they're things that are more proximate to the motion. But there are also things that you want to launch probably later that you are also able to substantiate, like things about cultural relatedness or indigenous people getting displaced or all of these things. These are also things that you want to talk about, but probably things that you do not want to immediately launch because these things cannot be fully built by your first speaker because they have much bigger priorities. It doesn't mean that these arguments are hierarchized based off of their importance, but it means then that there are things that need to be said first and there are things that need to be said later. So you can segment those things and redistribute these arguments to first and second respectively. And you're able to build those extensively because you've already separated your arguments, right? This means then that rather than having PM talk about four cases and leaving every analysis to your second speaker, you want to be able to have probably two cases from your PM, two cases from your DPM, and allow both of those speakers to build those discussions so it's much more fortified. So the responsive speakers, like for example, DPM and then DLO has to respond to you, they feel more pressure to respond because it means that your case is much more fortified. So if they'll take longer times to respond, and just make sure that your case evolution becomes adjusted to the context of the debate, which I'll talk about later in part two. Which then allows responses to not only be flagged in your speech, but also integrated within your rounds to add dynamicity to your discussions in the round, which I'll also talk about in terms of crediting later. So this is where let's assume the best case and both cases have evolutionary discussions. So a mutually evolved debate is now what you call an engaging debate, right? You can see their little tips. They're able to intersect each other, so that means that they're engaging with their discussion. Because this type of debate shows the attempt on both houses to actually reach out and engage with both sides. Also, it doesn't mean that the engagement only happens in government whip or opposition whip. The triangle just means their house. That's just a diagram. Anyways, so it makes for a debate that's interesting because it adds layers of analysis. Because now that you're evolving your case, you constantly add specific things towards an existing case. For example, in a debate about accountability, I'll probably add the mechanisms to provide that accountability, why accountability is important, all these other things, and it allows for maximized case evolution because the growth of a case bounces off of the growth of the opposing case. What does this mean then? If the opposing case is not that evolved, it means that you also do not have a bunch of material that you can work with to evolve your case. Because once you create a specific case, an extension perhaps, you also kind of need to depend on the existing analysis that comes from your opposing team to make that case so that you're able to make sure that your case is engaging. Absent that, and if the opposing case is not really necessarily that engaging, what happens is most of your extensions become much more selfish, which is not your fault, but it means that there is a detriment to the case. There is a detriment to the debate. But necessarily, when there's maximized case evolution, what happens is that when LO or DLO become more dynamic in their discussions, it means that you're able to bounce off of their discussions and use those discussions to create your own extensions as well, which means then that you're able to also use other people's analysis, not just your own prime ministers, to be able to make those extensions so that you're able to, let's say, for example, solidify the win. For example, probably LO will combat PM's discussion on accountability by saying that it's not sustainable. So DPM can now talk about why sustainability happens when people are put into accountability, stuff like that. This means then, when there's engaging discussions, it means that there is an ability for the judge to be able to weigh those discussions because they hit each other. When they hit each other, the comparison becomes much easier. And it means that if you're able to clinch the win on an engaged discussion, you're able to clinch the debate. So the evolution does not end at the second speaker. So this is very important. The third speaker also needs to allow the case's launch to come into full fruition. So rather than just leaving them alone, your goal is also to respond, to weigh, and to analyze, to also probably add missing analysis that comes from your first and second speaker that wasn't necessarily flagged. So reiterate, clean up the debate, all of these things. That's what a whip does usually. So you seal the analysis of the case by adding comparatives, probably best case, worst case, world comparisons, etc. And you utilize the existing analysis of your first two speakers as a response. So, for example, government talks about, hey, I want to be able to better the economy. And opposition says, no, you can't better the economy if you do not have uh, urgency or whatever. So you can say, as a response, why is wrong, the urgency case is wrong because of the analysis coming from the mechanism of bettering the economy. You cannot adapt and you cannot address urgency if you do not have the economy to be able to address that urgency in the first place. So now, rather than your responses just becoming floating, your responses also do two things. One is destroy the case of opposition while uplifting your first case, which is a mechanism of evolution. And lastly, it solidifies the importance of your case. So, notice then, species evolution only wins if it increases the fitness or survivability of the species. It is your job to be able to make sure that your debate and your case becomes important, to tie back to the win condition, tie back to the discussion on what the motion actually calls for. Likewise, your case will only become fully advantageous the moment you prove why you win the win condition at the very end of the day. This means then, as a whip, your main goal in terms of the evolutionary process is to be able to solidify why you win the evolutionary fight or why you win the evolutionary war. It means that you're one of the most adaptive teams and you're also one of the most engaging and how do I say this? One of the most developed teams in the round, right? So before I move on, this is where I'll allow questions to happen, probably verbally, preferably, but you can ask in chat. So before we move on to the process of extending, which is the mechanism for evolution, do you guys have any questions?
May I ask,
Yeah, go.
how do I create evolution as a whip?
I already told you this, but to be able to create evolution as a wave, you have the capacity to do two things, but it's actually three. But I just merged the two inside one thing. So the first thing is, of course, I talked about responses because the responses are not just things that destroy a destroy an opposing team, but they're also things that uplift your case. So whips can be really sneaky and add a new layer of analysis inside the response, which is a good strategy because it means that, hey, I can say things that uplift my first speaker or second speaker while also destroying the opposing team while also adding new analysis to solidify the case. And this means that you're evolving the case because the case then becomes not only much more dynamic and engaging, but it also means that the case itself becomes much more solidified because you have the capacity to use your responses as a mechanism to solidify the case. The second way is to be able to compare and contrast because comparatives and weighing metrics are also mechanisms of case evolution. Why so? Because they're what ties back the importance of the discussion. Of course, as I said a while ago, species evolution only wins if it increases the fitness or survivability of the species. Any evolution can happen, but you need to pinpoint the importance of your evolution. So, in that case, if you want to be able to pinpoint that importance, you want to be able to probably weigh these things, see which one is better than the other case, talk about why yours is better than the other case, talk about how you're able to win on specific metrics and specific weighing mechanisms, and then ultimately win the debate in terms of that evolutionary regard. So, any other questions?
Hi, Teacher Kelvin. Someone sent me a message. Can I read it to you verbally?
Is it in the chat? I can see that messages in the chat.
So I think they sent it to me, but I'm not sure if you
Okay.
can see. Yeah, the question was, how can each speaker best contribute in prep time so that the case can be evolved? Maybe like a guide so that all of them can be productive in prep time. What do you suggest?
Here's the thing. The way you prep is ultimately a dynamic discussion, which probably I would need to be able to coach you guys in order to understand this. But in an AP, oh my God, I was cracked. In an AP debate, probably you'd want to first spend the 5 minutes. Whenever you do the 5 minute veto time in an in an AP tournament, you have to veto the motion. You have to prep usually for the second motion because you won't normally guarantee the first motion. And when you prep the second motion, what happens is your first speaker, you have to leave the first speaker alone probably for the next 5 minutes. So there's 10 minutes of alone time for your first speaker. Do not rush the first speaker and do not allow your first speaker to also rush into the discussion, right? Because the moment your first speaker rushes into the discussion, what happens is that your first speaker frantically tries to pick up every discussion that is important, and it means that there's nothing left for you. This means then, when you have thinking time and when you have time to process that discussion, the next 10 minutes of those discussion is to talk about what you guys think the argument could be, what you guys think your arguments could be, and of course, each person has a specific role for a whip because you do not have to build arguments. Probably you can do two things. One is to be the devil's advocate and to try to argue and to try to argue in lieu of opposition or in lieu of government and to try to say, hey, what if they say this as a preemption mechanism? This adds preemptions for government, especially for your first speakers, especially if they need preemptions. For example, the first speakers, probably they'll flag those preemptions. But then secondly, a whip can also create cases as well because of course just because we're a whip doesn't mean that we don't have a thinking process. We can create discussions that can also probably contribute towards even create cases itself if you're confident with the cases that you created as a whip. For second speaker, what you want to be able to do is compartmentalize your speech into two things. Not your speech, your notes. The second speaker has to compartmentalize floating responses that come from opposition, or your opposing team. So probably you're not going to write stuff yet, but you're also going to insert your preemptions, and you're going to make sure that you're able to respond to those preemptions. So if the opposition flags it, you kind of don't need to say it again, and you kind of don't need to write it again. And then secondly is the arguments that you want to be able to talk to. I talked about this a while ago, but you want to be able to make sure that you're able to segment your discussions. So probably a rule of two, three, or two, two. So two arguments for PM, two arguments or three arguments for DPM. And it means that also you can do one argument PM, three arguments DPM. It depends on how egregious and how important the argument is. But it really, really depends on your team dynamic, what the debate or the motion is, and what is most urgent to talk about in the round. So if there's any other questions, you can flag it right now before we move on to the next discussion.
I have a question about a prep time. So what if other members refuse to collaborate during
What if other members refuse to collaborate? I think that you can do two things. One is usually sometimes I can not collaborate and I can refuse to cooperate in prep time sometimes personally because maybe I fell asleep in the prep time or stuff like that. Try your best to make sure that you have the capacity to think about these things even without them so that, of course, you can't always rely on your teammates. But then, secondly, make sure that you're able to flag that those teammates should not do those things ever again. For example, if they keep falling asleep in prep time or if they don't respond when asked questions, then you should probably just flag them and tell them that they should cooperate next time. Because debate, regardless of what happens, is a team sport and it requires the contributions of each specific person to be able to make sure that the team will work. I cannot tell you how to better your team dynamics because this is not the lecture for that. Of course, I would need to coach you for that to be able to happen. But I can tell you that there are specific strategies you can do. The strategy I talked about a while ago is not a standstill strategy. You don't have to follow that strategy, but it's a strategy that can work depending on the type of debate you want to be able to pursue. It really is ultimately up to the person if they want to contribute or if they don't want to contribute. And maybe let's try to make sure that we have the adaptability to be able to do things on our own, and then just blame them afterwards if they don't do anything. Or maybe just talk about it. Don't blame them, just talk about it with each other.
Thank you.
Is there any other question? So I'll count 5. If there's no other questions, I'll move to the next discussion. 3. Wait. Is my camera open?
No,
No.
your camera's not open.
Ooh, my bad. I was under the assumption. Hello? Can you see me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna do this instead so that I can see if my camera is open while I, do the thing. So, oof. Okay. So cool. Assuming we're all set, we can go to the next discussion, which is probably the thing that you guys want, the process of extending. Here, how do you evolve your case? So just like biology, since I'm a biology student, of course I'm going to apply these things. How do you evolve your case? When you evolve your case, you need a starting point. So, of course, every form of evolution, like single cell evolution or multicellular evolution, they all come from an origin point. Probably the first archaic bacteria or the primordial soup. It doesn't matter. You don't need to know this. Probably, maybe there's a science motion. Maybe there's not a science motion in your next future tournaments. Anyways, I'm not here to matter load. So, this origin point in a setting like debate probably looks like a frame, an existing case, a piece of world building, all of those things, right? So your prime minister probably launched that origin point that, hey, the status quo is kind of bad, and we have to fix it. And this is where you ask the necessary questions needed to establish your evolution. And yes, extensions are case evolutions, because that's the main way to evolve your case, to extend the case. So this is the skeletal build of a case, right? So of course, context, proof, tieback. These are terms that you guys probably aren't aware of, but I'll talk about its relation to existing debate terminologies later. The context is the reasoning, the proof is the impact, and the tieback is the importance. Example, an argument of accountability. The nation continuously injustices its citizens, which is the context. And hence, we need to provide justice to the masses, which is the proof or the impact. This is what solves the injustice, which is the tieback. You talk about why you're able to use the proof to solve the context. So, this is translation into debate terms. So probably in your context, you think about frame, reasoning, analysis, world building, status quo, incentive, things that build a proof or things that build a level of analysis towards what is currently going on, what needs to be talked about, and how you're able to pace throughout your arguments. And this is where you build on to your proof, which is the arguments, the impacts, your pragmatic or principled discussions. But I'm not going to talk to you about pragmatic and principled discussions because these are things that you probably should have already learned when you talk about making a case. So this is about extending policies, actions, and limitations. You know that. And then there's tieback, which is the conclusion. You're weighing the importance, relevance, comparative engagement. I think you already know all these terms, but if not, the conclusion, the summarization, the weighing is basically how you compare one thing to another and how, in terms of a specific metric. The importance is how you tie back to the win condition. If it's important in the round, you talk about, hey, it's important because the debate calls for accountability. It is the same thing as relevance and comparative engagement come intuitively. So they're often referred to in debate as, and I'll try to say this in debate speak. 3 structural reasons why we're correct, stuff like that. That's reasons, layers, substantiation. Those are the debate terms that you often encounter in debate, and they often come into one of these 3 discussions: context, proof, and tieback. So this is where there's a text error. Anyways, don't mind the text error. This is where extending 101 happens. So the first method is to vertically extend. I've already talked about this in previous sessions, but I'll try to talk about this more nuanced in this discussion. So There's two strategies to vertically extend. The first strategy is one, you find something your first speaker forgets to mention or underbuilds from the three and then build it. So, probably, let's do an argument on accountability. And let's say they forgot to talk about the context. In your discussion, in your extension, you talk about what the context is then and how the context is important in the round. Like, for example, both team, no, don't say both teams. For example, notice that the context, so that you don't knife your first speaker, say, notice that the context of the round is to blah, 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 blah. Hence, this justifies the discussion on PM because it sets into motion that we need to push for accountability. That's how you use it, right? So the positioning of this extension, when you do discuss it, is it should be standalone and developing. So rather than saying to uplift my first speaker, and then you immediately go to that strategy, you probably say, um, like accountability is often lacking, and people and police or politicians are often corrupt, which is the analysis, assuming that's the analysis. And then all of these things, this is analysis that proves my first speaker, just like the example that I talked about a while ago. This makes the development of your case mutually credible or creditable to both speakers. So now the thing I said can be credited to me because I already affirmed that I was the one who talked about these things, rather than banking all of my discussions on the first speaker, while also using the things I talk about to uplift my first speaker. So this also adds valuable content to your speech in extension, pun intended. So this is another mechanism to vertically extend. So the strategy is to find something that doesn't need to be mentioned about the case, but will still uplift the case itself. So how does this work? Probably you're not going to look at tie back, you're not going to look at context, you're not going to look at proof, or maybe you can look at context, proof, and tie back, but these are things that you can add as supplementary. So they're not necessarily things that you urgently need to add. So what happens is that it's kind of like a pseudo horizontal, but the pseudo horizontal is still vertical because it's a direct build of an existing case. So the position of this extension should mostly be standalone if you're a second speaker, with a tie back to the first speaker or an exchange. So their examples include in a discussion or in a debate about urgency, probably you can talk about why agency is tied to the principle of humanity or whatever, right? Sorry, I said urgency, I meant agency. So in a discussion about agency, like people need agency and stuff like that. You can talk about why agency, in extension, is tied to the principle of humanity, which means that humans are defined by agency, which automatically solidifies the win in the first speaker clash, right? So it means that I'm able to position this as a standalone argument while it's still being beneficial towards the entire case. Before I move on, do you guys have any questions in terms of the vertical extension, or if you guys have any inquiries? Hello? Hmm. Um, Raise your hand if you have a question. Can I see? Or probably just unmute. Okay. I'm assuming no questions exist. So let's move on. Wait. So, oops. This is what a vertical extension looks like. So, there's a case on top, and then visually, it extends down. So there's additional frames, analysis, reasoning, impacts, conclusions, importance, swing, etc. What are these terms? I've already talked about these terms. See, these are all in here. So these are all different mechanisms of um, context, proof, and tieback. You just add them to the existing case. Now, here's the horizontal extension, right? So you notice you extended vertically, there's an extension vertically, but you can also launch an entirely new case. So here is how the method of horizontal extension works. The strategy is to find an extension that does three essential things. Firstly, it expands the debate by introducing new cases. For example, if your prime minister talks about, hey, I want to talk about economic importance. What else can you talk about? The debate is about ecotourism, and I'll talk about economic. Your prime minister talks about economic importance. What other things can you guys talk about? Like other cases aside from economic importance. Can you guys give me one? I'll check. The discussion is about ecotourism. So I say, as prime minister, um, I want to talk about economic importance. What else can you talk about? What other cases, independent of economic importance, can I talk about? Hello? You guys can unmute, by the way, or you guys can just chat it out. Political incentives. Yeah. Political incentives, like how these politicians probably will decide to make ecotourism much more palatable for ecological preservation, those things. So you can always create new discussions or new arguments that are in contingency, and it expands the debate by introducing new cases. Second, it actively engages and responds to your preceding opposing speech. There needs to be a purpose for your extension. If it's not actively engaging and responding to your preceding opposing speech, then even if it is an important extension, it's not a strategic extension. So, how do you fix this if you already have an extension? For example, let's say political incentives, but your opposition, it doesn't really respond to opposition. Probably you'll add analysis to that extension. Maybe you can try to pivot that extension and say, if opposition talks about how ecotourism ruins the lives of indigenous folks who live in the area, you can say, hey, at least in under ecotourism, the political incentives make sure that these indigenous folk have jobs when their lands are being protected by these ecotourist spots. So you were able to make it engaging. Every case can be engaging as long as you add the necessary discussion to make it engaging. And lastly, this is still logically cohesive to the case. So when you add a discussion, you need to make sure that that discussion or that extension is not contradictory to anything that was said earlier. Why? Because even if you do not get um, penalized for that contradiction, what happens is that extension will not be credited, which means that you probably wasted 2 to 3 minutes of your time building a case that will not be credited. So, example, on a debate about crime, your first speaker launches an incarceration case. Like we have to make sure that incarceration is bettered, and we have to make sure that the jail system is much more uplifted. And opposition counters it with an opportunity cost case. So opposition says, hey, but that's a huge opportunity cost. What about things like social services? You can talk about the economics of incarceration to nations. Like, hey, you're able to make prison industries, you're able to make free labor, etc. Because prison workers often exist and they're there to help in factories. So it means then that you're able to address the opportunity cost by saying that the incarceration also generates profit for the country at the very end of the day. Before we move on, are there any questions? Hello? I'll count till 10. I'll count 10. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. Oh, you have a question? Sure. You can unmute or you can just type it. Hmm. So let's just wait for the question. How do you know if your discussion to connect your impact to make it engaging is enough to defeat ops case? Here's the thing. Um, You will never know if it's enough to defeat Ops case because debate is a communicative competition, meaning that probably even if you think it defeats Op case, your adjudicator might think it doesn't defeat Op case. What you want to do is address the discussions and probably wait lang. The discussions, address your discussions based off of the existing discussions that were already existing earlier. Like the three things, let me just go back. Ito. Sorry, I'm speaking Tagalog. I didn't mean to. Context, proof, and tieback. So, you know, when you respond, often you respond in the same way. And this is a spoiler for the next part, but I'll just do it to answer the question. When you respond in the same way you build. So, for example, if an argument is very context heavy, like it depends on the context to prove itself. Like, hey, there's already an existing corruption. You can say simply, no, there's no existing corruption. Everything's perfectly fine. So it deteriorates the case. You don't have to respond to everything. You just have to respond to the thing that is most important and that is most banking for that case itself. Uh, or for proof, if the most important discussion is impact, so regardless of the context, the impact is still important. Like, it still provides economic incentives for indigenous folks. You can say, well, those economic incentives come from displacing them, which is still a net loss. So, yeah, target things from specific lenses, and this is where you build your discussion or your engagement. So, that's probably, you will never know if you will win the clash, but you will know if you're able to deteriorate the logic of the clash. So, do you have any more questions? Okay. If there's no more questions, I'll move on to the next slide. You don't always have to do both. Even if you're a second speaker and you want to vertically extend or horizontally extend, you don't always have to do both. You can do both if it's strategic, but in debates, you can always decide to only choose one or the other. Because I think the question that's going on in your heads is that, hey, I know that I can horizontally and vertically extend. The question is, which one should I choose? Both are valid case evolutions. You just need to check if certain conditions meet, and you will probably understand which one you should do in pivoting once you see the debate. So, you should check if the case from your first doesn't need rebuilding even after opposing responses. This means it probably means that you're gonna waste your time if you do a vertical extension because, of course, it doesn't need rebuilding anymore. So, what you have to do is to just make a horizontal extension to just solidify the margin. Or the cases of opposition are alarming enough for you to need to repivot. So, wait, sorry, I just got a missed audio call. Um, give me a moment. Okay. Assuming that's fine. I'm still audible, right? Wait. I saw a hello. Can I confirm if I'm still audible? Oh, there's a chat. You have someone on your team to be a traitor and take up arguments against it so we can make sure your case is flawless. Yeah, that's also correct. Preemptions are always one of the best ways to make sure that the case, even if it's not going to win, is solidified in extension. So, of course, you always have to preempt. Um, Make sure that the preemptions are uh, actually preemptions because sometimes we make up our own cases for the opposite team, but it actually is the furthest thing that the opposite team will talk about. Make sure that the extensions are, I make sure that the preemptions you have to their cases are engaging. So you make sure that these preemptions often come at your worst case. So maybe even if you lose all accountability, you can still, you can still win, stuff like that. That's a good preemption. Let's move back in. The cases of
Excuse me?
opposition are alarming enough. Hello?
About the prediction of other team's case. What are the chances of our case about the negative team is not true or not accurate? Then how are we and what will we do if it's not?
Okay, good thing. I think this question can be more answered socially than can be answered technically in debate. What you want to do to make sure what you want to do to make sure that your case is able to properly preempt the opposite team is, of course, if you've been in debate for a while, you can understand your opponents. Understand not just your opponents, but probably understand your judges as well. Maybe understand what the judges prioritize and all these other things, and how these judges probably weigh the debate so that you're able to pivot your discussion and pivot their preemptions. So even if they don't launch the preempted case that you talk about, you still win because, of course, you're focusing. You say that, oh my God, even if they don't say this preemption is the best case. And this is how you solidify that that you're still able to win, regardless of if they launch the preemption or not. So a certainty preemption is the best opposition case. Disrupt that preemption immediately. So it means that even if you fail that preemption, you still win. So you do you have any other questions before we move on? Oh, by the way, guys, just chill in the chat. Uh, you don't need to. I don't know if this is like a banter or friendly banter, but I just don't be bad to each other. Okay, okay, it's nothing to worry about. Okay, let's move on. There is an urgency to add to existing case that you are scared any of the next speakers might catch. So here's the thing: your case evolution does not really only depend on what everyone just said, but also what everyone might say, which is why preemptions are very necessary. And let me just turn on my electric fan. Anyways, so what happens is that um, even if you're sure that the first speaker of the opposing team didn't talk about this, you're not sure if the second speaker will talk about this. So you want to make sure that, hey, there's an urgency to add to existing cases that you're scared any of the next speakers might catch. You want to be able to launch these cases immediately as a way to mitigate a sort of discussion that might happen in the opposing benches that you might not be able to catch because you're already done speaking. And lastly, there is an argument that yields really important that was not launched by your first. So probably you can go drink water while listening. Just think of me as a podcast. Anyways, I also kind of need to drink water, but I'll be fine. There is an argument that yields really important that was not launched by your first. What you want to do is, rather than prioritize on vertical extensions, you want to prioritize horizontal extensions. So, yeah, chat. Well, it's a lot of chats. Anyways, do you have any questions before we move on? Okay. Okay, I'll check the questions in the chat because I have there's a lot of questions, I guess. Okay. Can I go drink water? Sure. Chat toilet if I should remove a random person. Okay. Anyways, what if your preemptions aren't the things the opposition didn't talk about it, but a completely different case? No, you don't waste your time. As I said a while ago, uh, say that the preemption you provide is the most important case that op can run. So if they talk about a completely different case, your second speaker can double down on it and say, look, they didn't run the case that was supposed to give them the win, which means that their pivot ultimately becomes less important. You understand? It's like it's like accusing someone and then accusing someone of doing something and then shaming that someone, not shaming, or making someone feel wrong because they didn't do the thing that you accused. For example, I can say, and I'll do this to my fellow co-cap Matthew, I can say, The only way for Matthew to win is to be able to make sure that he talks about the importances of accountability. But so it means that once I talk about my preemption, so I'll say, but even if he launches the discussion about accountability, I say that he's still wrong, stuff like that. So I'm able to win on two fronts. One, if Matthew takes that discussion on accountability, he still loses because I preempted. But then secondly, even if he doesn't take the discussion on accountability, he now has further burden to prove why that discussion is more important than the discussion on accountability. So you kind of get it now, right? So any other question?
I didn't have a question.
Okay, you don't have a question. Yeah, okay. So, how do you know if your preemptions are enough? I think that rather than pivoting your mentality on if your preemptions are enough, try to make sure that you think your preemptions are not sufficient. Your preemptions can elevate your existing case or can elevate your existing position. So it means that you're pivoting your mental sufficiency of a preemption to a positive rather than a negative control. Because thinking of it as enough is a negative control. There's no risk to use preemption. Um, in fact, even if you give them the winning case, that's the point of preempting. You rebut that winning case. What you want to do rather is when you have preemptions, make sure you don't dwell on it that much. Probably integrate it in your argument. So I say, notice that we need accountability, which means that even if opposition talks about mechanisms like sustainability, it cannot happen if you're not able to provide the prerequisite accountability, stuff like that. So try making your preemptions part of the bill so that it doesn't become useless. Any other questions?
Excuse me, this question is quite personal. So what? How should we pick? How should we pick the preemption? How should we pick the person to do the preemption?
Okay. Anyone can do preemptions, but if you want to do role picking, you can probably. This is what I talked about a while ago, the devil's advocate thing. Your whip is what provides your preemptions the most because your whip is supposed to be the most prospective of the debaters. Because they have to understand what debate might run through and what they might say so that they can add to their speech as whip because they're a responsive speaker. So they have nothing to say if there's nothing that opposition will say. So probably the responsibility goes to whip if you want to add responsibility. But again, this is just a role thing. It's a personal thing, like you said. Anyone can do preemptions. It's just if you want to do that strategy, that's fine. So no more questions?
No,
Excuse me, so if we want to do the preemption picking, should we pick the people based on the skill? Based on the skill and the amount of time it took to prepare their arguments and their cases?
Rather than skill, I think that the reason why you pick the third speaker or your whip for your for your preemptions is mainly because not just that they're the most prospective, but also because they're the third speaker, so they don't have much to say. They can't say a lot of things. And of course, if you can't say a lot of things because you're not allowed to build, then probably you have a lot of time in prep to be able to be the devil's advocate and work for those preemptions intuitively. So yeah, it's more so a strategy thing than it is a who's the best thing. So, you have any other question? Are there any other questions?
no, no question.
Okay, cool. Anyways, let's move on. Cool. I know you guys are all very, very overwhelmed, but this is the last one, the last chapter. And after this, we'll have general questions and answers. So, this is a very small chapter, response and weighing dynamics. So, responses are also evolution. And it's very important because the responses are not just floating. And I talked about this a while ago. They depend on multiple factors, such as the existing analysis of your case, i.e., what your discussion already flagged, and the ongoing development of the round. So, launching a response, like, say, for example, accountability, and your op says sustainability, and for some reason you just talk about economic incentives as a response. Launching a response that was not formulated from any preceding analysis, so anything that was talked about a while ago, will look like launching an entirely new argument. And that's very important because it means now, if you're launching something entirely new, like a new argument, you will be burdened to build such argument in order to justify its existence. So make sure that your responses are careful. They're not just there to break the opposite case, but they're also there to make a stand for your existing case. They're the most engaging parts of the discussion because they're active attacks towards an existing other case. So you need to make sure that those responses come from things already talked about. For example, my first speaker and second speaker talked about accountability. So I probably go like, opposition cannot win because they cannot provide accountability, stuff like that. You have to pivot on things you already talked about. So next, you destroy the same way you build. And I also talked about this a while ago. Just like arguments, responses also have three structural layers. Those all come from the same building materials arguments use. So to destroy those things, you also have to contest its correctness, which is the context, or its impact, which is the proof, or its importance, which is the tie bag. For example, any argument or an argument on sustainability without the context can easily be rebutted by saying the policy on sustainability is unnecessary. Why is this true? Because if there's no context to say, oh, our natural resources are depleting, oh, we need to save money because we're a developing country, then frankly, you can say it's sustainable, sure, but it's unnecessary because there's much better expansionary procedures, stuff like that. So when you respond, you have to destroy the building blocks of those arguments. And the way you respond is the same way you build. So you respond to say, one, first structural layer, it's not true. Second structural layer, even if it's true, it's not that impactful. Last structural layer, even if it's true and impactful, it's not important. So next, okay, there's two ways to weigh. I know, pun intended. There's two ways to weigh. First off, best case, worst case. This is very simple. You just think on the top of your head. What is the best case in our side? What is the best case in opponent's side? What is the worst case in our side? What is the worst case in opponent's side? The best way to win this is to compare your worst case and the opponent's best case. It means that even at all of your wrongs and all of their rights, you still win. That is the best clincher. But even if you but if you think, oh, I kind of don't win that, that's fine. It probably just means that you can pivot in other mechanisms like, oh, what my best case is better than the opponent's best case. How do you do the best case, worst case thing? I'll make it very simple. There's two arguments. Probably the first is on developing the economy. The second is on protecting the land and protecting the indigenous. So I'm opposition, assuming I'm opposition. I'll say, hey, even if they're able to make economic prosperity, which is their best case, it's much better in our best case because we're able to make sure that the people who actually live in these areas are able to continue living the same way they need to live. Because it's very bad to embolden them in very huge economic practices that they're not supposed to be part of because they're supposed to be indigenous folks who should not be intercepted by huger economies, stuff like that. So it means that you take something at their best, take something at their worst, take yours on the same, and compare and contrast these things. The last thing is world comparisons. So you try building both worlds, and this is where you become your most introspective. So how does this manifest? So let's try to do this house prefers a world without fear. So I'll do this in a debate discussion. If I was opposition, so if I were to say a world comparison, in a world without fear, there would be no way for you to brace yourself for danger, which is bad. The comparative, which is in a world with fear, at least you have the capacity to make sure that you do not effectively become numb towards pain and that you're resilient and you automatically fight back against certain types of dangers, and you know when to run and when not to run. So that's how you world build. You try building both worlds, try prospecting the different scenarios, and it allows the judge to gain a better grasp or understanding of the debate, and to also allow the mentality of, especially since judges require this, if these worlds did exist, if the implementation happened, if I believed in something, if I predict on something, which one would be the better mechanism? What would be the better world? What would provide the better truth value? Which proves the predicts better? Stuff like that. Assuming this is what happens, it means that you're able to make sure that the debate automatically becomes a win on your side, because even at the most macro aspects, at the most meta aspects, you're able to win the debate. So this is where the Q&A session starts. If you guys have any questions, feel free to flag right now. I'm open for a barrage of questions. So just unmute your mic. Hello?
No question.
No questions? How about other people? This is practically the end of the session, so I'd probably appreciate any questions.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
When we
No other
begin,
questions?
I know that working is very important, but how do I start working? Like, I know what I'm going to speak, but how can I begin to speak it? Like, what word do I need to use when read it?
Okay. Try reiterating the question, because my the volume of my iPad was kind of bad. Say it again.
How can I begin my working when I already knew what to speak? Like, how can I start?
Ah, this talks about case structure, and this talks about um uh like speech structure, which I'm not obliged to talk about, but I'll talk about anyways. So if you want to launch your whipping, probably you launch your whipping by first off, one of the most important responses. So you say the reason opposition loses is because whoop, and then you use that as a prelude to all of your discussions. Or you can do a hook discussion and say that like probably the reason why we win is because of, just make sure that your intro is pretty declarative. So because it's a whip, you have to be very aggressive with your whipping. It doesn't mean that you have to shout, but you have to be very aggressive with your whipping, and very you know where to whip and how to whip it. So once you launch, there is a problem with up, or there is a benefit in gov. That's where you bank your entire case in. For example, the problem in opposition is they can never really guarantee any accountability, which means that they can never push for any prerequisites. This is why, even if opposition talks about the benefits of being able to push for sustainability, opposition can never really prove why sustainability is accrued if the same politicians are not put into accountability. You can tell that I use the first sentence as a prelude to the discussions and the responses I talk about later, so it becomes more cohesive as a speech. But this is just a suggestion. Of course, there's many other ways to format your speech, but this is how I would do it.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? I'll count probably 15 seconds. If there's no questions within 15 seconds, then let's move on. So 1, 2, 14, 15. So that ends the Q&A session, and it also ends the discussions. So thank you everyone for coming. The PPT will be sent soon, as well as the recording for the meeting, so that you guys can run through and run back on the discussions, because of course the PowerPoint can't tell you everything, but that's how to evolve your case. And hope to see you guys in Vietnam Intervarsity Debating Championship. So good luck everyone.
Thank you guys.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye, teacher.
Bye,
Bye.
teacher.
Bye,
Bye,
teacher.
teacher.
Goodbye, teacher.
Goodbye, teacher.
Goodbye, teacher.
Goodbye, teacher.
Teacher.